In this tutorial, we will cover chapter 3.4 of the book Spring Boot Quick Start. This chapter describes how to use services inside a Spring Boot web application. As already mentioned in previous videos, services consist of service classes. These are the classes that implement business logic. These classes present the core of every Spring Boot application. All other classes are there just to support the service classes, like controller, which is used to communicate with frontend, or a repository, which is used to communicate with database. DTOs, which are used to transfer data between controller and service, and entities, which are used to transfer data between service and repository. So what usually happens is that when the controller receives some data from the front end, it will simply transfer that data to my service class, and this class will do some business logic on that data. So this is a simplified approach when we have a specific service class that does some work. And in this schema, it is also shown how to use auto-wired annotation, which was covered in a previous video, to create instance of the myService class and inject it into myService property, so that my controller can use myService property to call different methods from the myService class. And myService class needs to be annotated with service in order to become a Spring Boot component bean. Otherwise, AutoWired will not be able to locate the class with this name. A more complicated approach when dealing with services is shown on this image here. Here we see that we first create a myService interface, which simply declares variables that need to be methods that need to be included into classes that will be implementing this interface. On the right side, there are examples of two classes which implement this interface. Just like in the previous example, these classes need to be annotated with a service annotation in order to become Spring Framework components, so that auto-wired annotation can find them, create instances of them, and then inject those instances into variables that can be then used by the myController to call different methods from within these implementations. This schema also shows how to use auto-wired in combination with qualifier annotation, which tells Spring Framework which class that implements this interface to instantiate and inject into the myService variable. So this annotation says that we want to instantiate Spring Framework component that has this name, and in our case this is the component that has this name, or in other words, this is this class that will be instantiated. We will now go through some tutorials that show in more details how to use services inside Spring Boot application in different ways. But first, we will start with this example, which shows approach where business logic is not located into service class, but instead it is part of the controller. So here we have a example of Spring Boot application that only has a controller. It doesn't have any services. And if we look at this controller, we can see that it has a single endpoint which can be accessed through hello which then calls this method. And inside this controller, there is a simple mockup of a business logic which simply defines this URL, which is then returned by the controller. So we start with this simple example to show that the service layer is not necessary, but it is a recommended practice not to have business logic inside controllers and their endpoints, but instead all business logic should be moved to a service classes. If we now call this controller through web browser, it will return this string. So this is an example where business logic is contained within the endpoint controller's endpoint. Now we will move this business logic from the controller into a service class, which is why in this tutorial we will create additional class which will be our service. So this is the new class that we are creating. It is annotated with service annotation so that Spring Framework could locate it when we inside the controller use AutoWire to create instance of this class. So in previous example, our simple business logic was placed inside the controller, and it was just setting a variable to a string, hello from controller. So this business logic, what we are going to do now is move it into a service class. Or in other words, the string is no longer defined in the controller, but now we defined this string into service class, and we can access this string through hello method of the service class. So inside the controller, in order to be able to use this service class, we use auto-wired annotation, which tells Spring Framework to find this class, create instance of it, and inject it into this property. So Spring Framework will locate this class, create an instance of that class, and inject that instance into this property. That way, when we call our endpoint, then inside the endpoint we can use this instance and access the method from the service class in order to get this string. This way we have removed our business logic from the controller and into the service class. And in the controller, what we do is simply call specific method of our service class that needs to do certain business logic. And this is a better way of designing application compared to having business logic inside the controller itself, as we shown in the previous example. In this example, we will show another way of accessing methods from a service where we will instantiate the service manually. So in the previous example, we have used AutoWire to tell Spring to create instance of the service class and inject it in the MyService property. This is a recommended way of doing things, but in this example, we will show what is actually happening in the background when we use AutoWire. We have already covered the usage of AutoWire annotation, but here we will just repeat this very fast. So instead of using AutoWire to create instance of our service class, as was shown in the previous tutorial, we can manually create that instance like this and then continue using MyService property inside the controller's endpoint as we would when using AutoWire. And here again, we will show, this example shows that instead of manually creating instance of our service, we can use AutoWire to tell Spring Framework to create that instance instead of us. And then we can use this instance in our endpoint. So in this example and in this example, we were creating instances of a specific class. But as shown previously, and this is what is shown by this schema, where my controller is either using AutoWire or directly creating instance of a specific class. In this two remaining example, we will, instead of classes, use interfaces, which is described with this schema here. When we use AutoWired on the interface, and then Spring Framework needs to figure out which class to use to instantiate and then to inject into the property. So here is a simple example where we have a single interface and a single class that implements that interface. So this is our interface, which says that the class needs to have a single method called hello, and this is class that implements this interface and defines the content of this hello method to return a string. Now inside the controller, in order to use this class, we can write this line here, where we are manually creating instance of this class. So we are telling Spring exactly which we are manually creating instance of the class we are interested in, and it returns the interface. Then we can use this property inside the controller's endpoint to call the method that was implemented by this implementation here. So here in this example, we weren't using AutoWire to create instance of class. So in the next example, we will show how to do the same by using AutoWire approach. Again, everything is the same in a sense that we still have single controller, single interface, and single class that implements this interface. So this is our interface, and this is the class that implements that interface. This is exactly the same as in a previous example, but now in the controller, we will use AutoWired annotation shown by this line, which tells Spring Framework to find a class that implements this interface, create instance of that class, and inject that instance into this property. Since we only have single class that implements this interface, Spring Framework will use this class. Make note that class needs to be annotated as a Spring Framework component, and one way to do that is to use service annotation. This will allow Spring Framework to locate the class and create its instance. Then inside the controller's endpoint, we can use instance of that class to call the method, which then returns this string. So basically in this chapter, we have shown how to use service layer so that business logic will not be contained within controller, but instead to be encapsulated inside the service classes. We have also shown how inside controller we can either manually or by using AutoWire create instance of our service class in order to call the methods that encapsulate business logic. And we have also shown how to use AutoWired or manually create instances of service classes that implement specific service interface. So when developing Spring Boot web applications, the approach that will be always used and is recommended is the one when we use AutoWire in combination to interface in order to tell Spring Framework which of the classes that implement that interface should be instantiated and injected into the property. In other words, this is described with this final tutorial where we have created Spring Boot application in that way. We have created an interface, then we have created a class that implements that interface and annotated that class with service annotation so that it becomes a Spring Framework component, so that AutoWire can find that class. And with this line, we are telling Spring Framework, find class that implements this interface, create instance of that class, and insert that instance into my service property so that inside endpoints we can use that instance to call service methods that implement certain business logic.